Well, thank you all very much for coming. It's really shocking to me that you don't have anything better to do on a Tuesday night. No, seriously though, it is. I mean, it's very strange in some sense that there's so many of you here to listen to a sequence of lectures on the psychological significance of the biblical stories. It isn't something I've wanted to do for a long time, but it still does surprise me that there's a ready audience for it. And, well, so that's good. So we'll see how it goes. And I'll start with this, because this is the right question. The right question is, why bother doing this? And I don't mean, why should I bother doing it? I have my own reasons for doing it, but you might think, well, why bother with this strange old book at all? And that's a good question, you know. It's a contradictory document that's been cobbled together over thousands of years. It's outlasted kingdoms, many, many kingdoms. You know, it's really interesting that it turns out that a book is more durable than stone. It's more durable than a castle. It's more durable than an empire. And that's really interesting, you know, that something in some sense so evanescent can be so long-living. So there's that. That's kind of a mystery. I'm approaching this whole scenario, the biblical stories, as if they're a mystery, fundamentally, because they are. There's a lot we don't understand about them. We don't understand how they came about. We don't really understand how they were put together. We don't understand why they had such an unbelievable impact on civilization. We don't understand how people could have believed them. We don't understand what it means that we don't believe them now, or even what it would mean if we did believe them. And then, on top of all that, there's the additional problem, which isn't specific to me, but is certainly relevant to me, that no matter how educated you are, you're not educated enough to discuss the psychological significance of the biblical stories. But I'm going to do my best, and partly because I want to learn more about them. And one of the things I've learned is that the best way to learn about something is to talk about it. And when I'm lecturing, I'm thinking, you know, I'm not trying to tell you what I know for sure to be the case, because there's lots of things I don't know for sure to be the case. I'm trying to make sense out of this, and I have been doing this for a long time. Now, you know, you may not, that I'm an admirer of Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a devastating critic of, I would say, dogmatic Christianity. Christianity as it was instantiated in institutions, I suppose, although he's a very paradoxical thinker, because, for example, one of the things Nietzsche said was that he didn't believe that the scientific revolution would have ever got off the ground if it hadn't been for Christianity, and more specifically for Catholicism, because he believed that over the course of really 1,000 years, the European mind, so to speak, had to train itself to interpret everything that was known within a single coherent framework. Coherent if you accept the initial axioms. A single coherent framework. And so Nietzsche believed that Catholicization of the phenomena of life and of history produced the kind of mind that was then capable of transcending its dogmatic foundations and then concentrating on something else, which in this particular case happened to be the natural world. And so Nietzsche believed that in some sense Christianity died at its own hand. It had spent a very long period of time trying to attune people to the necessity of the truth, you know, absent the corruption and all of that that's always part of any human endeavor. And then the truth, the spirit of the truth that was developed by Christianity turned on the roots of Christianity, and everyone woke up and said something like, or thought something like, well, how is it that we came to believe any of this? It's like waking up one day and noting that you really don't know why you put a Christmas tree up, but you've been doing it for a long time, and that's what people do. And you know, there are reasons that Christmas trees came about, but what would you say, the ritual lasts long after the reasons have been forgotten. So now Nietzsche, although he was a critic of Christianity and also a champion of its disciplinary capacity, because you see, the other thing that Nietzsche believed was that it was not possible to be free in some sense unless you had been a slave. And by that he meant that you don't go from childhood to full-fledged adult individuality. You go from childhood to a state of discipline, which you might think is akin to slavery, to self-imposed slavery. That would be the best scenario, where you have to discipline yourself to become something specific before you might be able to reattain the generality that you had as a child. And he believed that Christianity had played that role for Western civilization. But in the late 1800s, he announced that God was dead. And you often hear of that as something triumphant. But for Nietzsche, it wasn't, because he was too nuanced a thinker to be that simple-minded. See, Nietzsche understood that, and this is something I'm going to try to make clear, is that there's a very large amount that we don't know about the structure of experience, that we don't know about reality, and we have our articulated representations of the world, and then you could think of outside of that, there are things we know absolutely nothing about, and there's a buffer between them. And those are things we sort of know something about, and we don't know them in an articulated way. Here's an example. Sometimes you're arguing with someone close to you, and they're in a bad mood, and they're being touchy and unreasonable, and you keep the conversation up, and maybe all of a sudden they get angry, or maybe they cry, and then when they cry, they figure out what they're angry about, and it has nothing to do with you, even though you might have been what precipitated the argument, and that's an interesting phenomenon as far as I'm concerned, because it means that people can know things at one level without being able to speak what they know at another. And so in some sense, the thoughts rise up from the body, and they do that in moods, and they do that in images, and they do that in actions. And we have all sorts of ways that we understand before we understand in a fully articulated manner. And so we have this articulated space that we can all discuss, and then outside of that, we have something that's more akin to a dream that we're embedded in, and it's an emotional dream that we're embedded in, and that's based, at least in part, on our actions, and I'll describe that later. And then outside of that is what we don't know anything about at all. And in that dream, that's where the mystics live, and that's where the artists live, and they're the mediators between the absolute unknown and the things we know for sure. And you see, what that means in some sense is what we know is established on a form of knowledge that we don't really understand, and that if those two things are out of sync, so you might say if our articulated knowledge is out of sync with our dream, then we become dissociated internally. We think things we don't act out, and we act out things we don't dream, and that produces a kind of sickness of the spirit, and that sickness of the spirit, its cure is something like an integrated system of belief and representation. And then people turn to things like ideologies, which I regard as parasites on an underlying religious substructure, to try to organize their thinking, and then that's a catastrophe. And that's what Nietzsche foresaw. You see, he knew that when we knocked the slats out of the base of Western civilization by destroying this representation, this God ideal, let's say, that we would destabilize and move back and forth violently between nihilism, let's say, and the extremes of ideology. He was particularly concerned about radical left ideology, and believed and predicted this in the late 1800s, which is really an absolute intellectual tour de force of staggering magnitude. Predicted that in the 20th century that hundreds of millions of people would die because of the replacement of these underlying dreamlike structures with this rational but deeply incorrect representation of the world. And we've been oscillating back and forth between left and right in some sense ever since, and with some good sprinkling of nihilism in there and despair. And in some sense, that's the situation of the modern Western person, and increasingly of people in general. I think part of the reason that Islam has its backup with regards to the West to such a degree, there's many reasons, and not all of them are valid, that's for sure, but one of the reasons is that, they being still grounded in a dream, let's say, they can see that the rootless questioning mind of the West poses a tremendous danger to the integrity of their culture. Now, and it does. I mean, Westerners, us, we undermine ourselves all the time with our searching intellect, and I'm not complaining about that. You know, I mean, there isn't anything easy that can be done about it, but it's still a sort of fruitful catastrophe, and you know, it has real effects on people's lives. It's not some abstract thing, you know. I mean, lots of times when I've been treating people for depression, for example, or anxiety, they have existential issues, you know. It's not just some psychiatric condition. It's not just that they're tapped off of normal because their brain chemistry is faulty, although, you know, sometimes that happens to be the case. It's that they are overwhelmed by the suffering and complexity of their life, and they're not sure why it's reasonable to continue with it. You know, they can feel the terrible negative meanings of life, but are skeptical beyond belief about any of the positive meanings. I had one client who was a very brilliant artist, and as long as he didn't think, he was fine, you know, because he'd go and create, and he was really good at being an artist. He just, you know, he had that personality that was continually creative and quite brilliant, although he was self-denigrating. But as soon as he started to think about what he was doing, then, you know, it's like a drill or a saw or something like that. He'd saw the branch off that he was sitting on because he'd start to criticize what he was doing, even the utility of it, even though it was sort of self-evidently useful. And then it would be very, very hard for him to even motivate himself to create. And he always struck me as a good example of the consequences of having your rational intellect divorced in some way from your being, divorced enough so that it actually questions the utility of your being. And it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. And it's really not a good thing because it manifests itself not only in individual psychopathology, but also in social psychopathology. And that's this proclivity of people to get tangled up in ideologies, which I really do think of as they're like crippled religions. That's the right way to think about them. They're like a religion that's missing an arm and a leg but can still hobble along, and it provides a certain amount of security and group identity, but it's warped and twisted and demented and bent, and it's a parasite on something underlying that's rich and true, and that's how it looks to me anyways. And so I think it's very important that we sort out this problem. I think that there isn't anything more important that needs to be done than that. I've thought that for a long, long time, probably since the early 80s, when I started looking at the role that belief systems played in regulating psychological and social health. Because you can tell that they do that because of how upset people get if you challenge their belief systems. It's like, why the hell do they care exactly? What difference does it make if all of your ideological axioms are 100% correct? Like, people get unbelievably upset when you poke them in the axioms, so to speak. And it is not by any stretch of the imagination obvious why, you know. But it's like there's a fundamental truth that they're standing on. It's like they're on a raft in the middle of the ocean and you're starting to pull out the logs, you know, and they're afraid they're going to fall in and drown. It's like, drown in what? And what are the logs protecting them from? And why are they so afraid to move beyond the confines of the ideological system? And these are not obvious things. So I've been trying to puzzle that out for a very long time, and I've done some lectures about that are on YouTube. Most of you know that. And some of what I'm going to talk about in this series you'll have heard if you've listened to the YouTube videos. But, you know, I'm trying to hit it from different angles. And so Nietzsche's idea was that human beings were going to have to create their own values, essentially. Now, he understood that we had bodies and that we had motivations and emotions, like he was a romantic thinker in some sense, but way ahead of his time, because he knew that our capacity to think wasn't some free-floating soul, but was embedded in our physiology, constrained by our emotions, shaped by our motivations, shaped by our body. He understood that, but he still believed that the only possible way out of the problem would be for human beings themselves to become something akin to God and to create their own values. And he thought that he talked about the person who could create their own values as the overman or the superman, and that was one of the parts of Nietzschean philosophy that the Nazis, I would say, took out of context and used to fuel their, superior man ideology. So, and we know what happened with that. That didn't seem to turn out very well, that's for sure. And see, I also spent a lot of time reading Carl Jung, and it was through Jung and also Jean Piaget, who's a developmental psychologist, that I started to understand that our articulated systems of thought are embedded in something like a dream, and that dream is informed in a complex way by the way we act. So, we act out things we don't understand all the time, and if that wasn't the case, then we wouldn't need a psychology or a sociology or an anthropology or any of that, because we would be completely transparent to ourselves, and we're clearly not. So we're much more complicated than we understand, which means that the way that we behave contains way more information than we know. And part of the dream that surrounds our articulated knowledge has been extracted as a consequence of us watching each other behave and telling stories about it for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, extracting out patterns of behavior that characterize humanity and trying to represent them partly through imitation, but also through drama and mythology and literature and art and all of that, to represent what we're like so that we can understand what we're like. And that process of understanding is what I see unfolding, at least in part, in the biblical stories. And it's halting and partial and awkward and contradictory and all of that, which is one of the things that makes the book so complex. But I see in it the struggle of humanity to rise above its animal forebears, say, and to become conscious of what it means to be human. And that's a very difficult thing, because we don't know who we are, what we are, where we came from, or any of those things. And, the life is an unbroken chain going back 3.5 billion years. It's an absolutely unbelievable thing. Every single one of your ancestors reproduced successfully for 3.5 billion years. It's absolutely unbelievable. We rose out of the dirt and the muck, and here we are, conscious but not knowing. And we're trying to figure out who we are. And a story that we've been telling, or a set of stories that we've been telling for 3,000 years, seems to me to have something to offer. And so when I look at the stories in the Bible, I do it, I would say, in some sense, with a beginner's mind. It's a mystery, this book, how the hell it was made, why we preserved it, how it happened to motivate an entire culture for 2,000 years and to transform the world. Like, what's going on? How did that happen? It's by no means obvious, and one of the things that bothers me about casual critics of religion is that they don't take the phenomena seriously, and it's a serious phenomena. I mean, not least because people have the capacity for religious experience, and no one knows why that is. And I mean, you can induce it reliably in all sorts of different ways. You can do it with brain stimulation. You can certainly do it with drugs. There's especially the psychedelic variety. They produce intimations of the divine extraordinarily regularly. People have been using drugs like that for God only knows how long, 50,000 years, maybe more than that, to produce some sort of intimate union with the divine. It's like, we don't understand any of that. When we discovered the psychedelics in the late 60s, it shocked everybody so badly that they were instantly made illegal and abandoned in terms of research for like 50 years. And it's no wonder, because who the hell expected that? Nobody. Now Jung was a student of Nietzsche's, you see, and he was also, I would say, a very astute critic of Nietzsche. He was educated by Freud, and Freud, I suppose, in some sense, started to collate the information that we had pertaining to the notion that people lived inside a dream. It was Freud who really popularized the idea of the unconscious mind. And we take this for granted to such a degree today that we don't understand how revolutionary the idea was. Like, with what's happened with Freud is that we've taken all the marrow out of his bones, so to speak, and left the husk behind. And now when we think about Freud, we just think about the husk, because that's everything that's been discarded. But so much of what he discovered is part of our popular conception now, including the idea that your perceptions and your actions and your thoughts are all, what would you say, informed and shaped by unconscious motivations that are not part of your voluntary control. And that's a very, very strange thing. It's one of the most unsettling things about the psychoanalytic theories, because the psychoanalytic theories are something like, you're a loose collection of living sub-personalities, each with its own set of motivations, perceptions and emotions and rationales, all of that. And you have limited control over that. So you're like a plurality of internal personalities that's loosely linked into a unity. You know that because you can't control yourself very well, which is one of Jung's objections to Nietzsche's idea that we could create our own values. So Jung didn't believe that, especially not after interacting with Freud, because he saw that human beings were affected by things that were deeply, deeply affected by things that were beyond their conscious control. And no one really knows how to conceptualize those things. You know, the cognitive psychologists think about them in some sense as computational machines. And the ancient people, I think, thought of them as gods, although it's more complex than that. Like rage would be a god. Mars, the god of rage, that's the thing that possesses you when you're angry. You know, it has a viewpoint and it says what it wants to say, and that might have very little to do with what you want to say when you're being sensible. And it doesn't just inhabit you, it inhabits everyone, and it lives forever, and it even inhabits animals. And so it's this transcendent psychological entity that inhabits the body politic like a thought inhabits the brain. That's one way of thinking about it. It's a very strange way of thinking, but it certainly has its merits. And those things, well, in some sense, those are deities, although it's not that simple. And so Jung got very interested in dreams and started to understand the relationship between dreams and myths, because he would see in his clients' dreams echoes of stories that he knew because he was deeply read in mythology. And then he started to believe that the dream was the birthplace of the myth, and that there was a continual interaction between the two processes, the dream and the story, and storytelling. And, well, you know, you tend to tell your dreams as stories when you remember them. And some people remember dreams all the time, like 2 or 3 a night. I've had clients like that, and they often have archetypal dreams that have very clear mythological structures. I think that's more the case with people who are creative, by the way, especially if they're a bit unstable at the time, because the dream tends to occupy the space of uncertainty and to concentrate on fleshing out the unknown reality before you get a real grip on it. So it's like the dream is the birthplace of thinking. That's a good way of thinking about it. And so because it's the birthplace of thinking, it's not that clear. It's doing its best to formulate something. That was Jung's notion, as opposed to Freud, who believed that there were sensors, internal sensors, that were hiding the dream's true message. That's not what Jung believed. He believed the dream was doing its best to express a reality that was still outside of fully articulated conscious comprehension. It was, because you think, look, a thought appears in your head, right? That's obvious. Bang, it's nothing you ever ask about. But what the hell does that mean? A thought appears in your head. What kind of ridiculous explanation is that? You know, it just doesn't help with anything. Where does it come from? Well, nowhere. It just appears in my head. Okay, well, that's not a very sophisticated explanation, as it turns out, you know? And so you might think that those thoughts that you think, well, where do they come from? Well, they're often someone else's thoughts, right? Someone long dead, that might be part of it, just like the words you use to think are utterances of people who've been long dead. And so you're informed by the spirit of your ancestors. That's one way of looking at it. And your motivations speak to you, and your emotions speak to you, and your body speaks to you. And it all does all that, at least in part, through the dream. And the dream is the birthplace of the fully articulated idea. They don't just come from nowhere, fully fledged, right? They have a developmental origin, and God only knows how lengthy that origin is. Even to say something like, I am conscious, you know, that's taken... Chimpanzees don't say that. You know, it's been 7 million years since we broke from chimpanzees, something like that, from the common ancestor. You know, they have no articulated knowledge at all. They have very little self-representation in some sense, and very little self-consciousness. And that's not the case with us at all. And we had to painstakingly figure all of this out during that, you know, 7 million year voyage. And I think some of that's represented and captured in some sense in these ancient stories, which I believe were part of, especially the oldest stories in Genesis, which is the stories we're going to start with, that some of the archaic nature of the human being is encapsulated in those stories, and it's very, very instructive as far as I can tell. I can give you just a quick example. You know, there's an idea of sacrifice in the Old Testament, And it's pretty barbaric, you know. I mean, the story of Abraham and Isaac is a good example of that, because Abraham is called on to actually sacrifice his own son, which doesn't really seem like something that a reasonable God would ask you to do, right? And the God in the Old Testament is frequently cruel and arbitrary and demanding and paradoxical, and which is one of the things that really gives the book life, because it wasn't edited by a committee, you know, a committee that was concerned with not offending anyone, that's for sure. So Jung believed that the dream was the birthplace of thought. And I've been extending that idea because one of the things I wondered about deeply was, you know, you have a dream and then someone interprets it. And you can argue about whether or not an interpretation is valid, just like you can argue about whether your interpretation of a novel or movie is valid, right? It's a very difficult thing to determine with any degree of accuracy, which counts in part for the postmodern critique. But my observation has been that people will present a dream and sometimes we can extract out real useful information from it that the person didn't appear to know. You know, and they get a flash of insight, and to me that's a marker that we've stumbled on something that unites part of that person that wasn't united before. It pulls things together, which is often what a good story will do, or sometimes a good theory. You know, things snap together for you, and there's a little light goes on, and that's one of the markers that I've used for accuracy in dreams. And I know in my own family, when I was first married, you know, I'd have fights with my wife, arguments about this and that, and I'm fairly hot-headed, and so I'd get all puffed up and, you know, agitated about whatever we were arguing about, and she'd go to sleep, which was really annoying, you know, so annoying, because I couldn't sleep, right? I was like chewing off my fingernails, and she'd be like sleeping peacefully beside me. It's like maddening. So, but often she'd have a dream, you know, and then the next morning she'd discuss it with me, and then we could unravel what was at the bottom of our argument, and that was unbelievably useful, even though it was extraordinarily aggravating. So you know, I was convinced by Jung. It looked to me like his ideas about the relationship between dreams and mythology and drama and literature made sense to me, and the relationship between that and art. I know this native carver, he's a Kwakwaka'wakw guy. He's carved a bunch of wooden sculptures, totem poles, and masks that I have in my house. And he's a very interesting person, not literate, not particularly literate, and really still steeped in this ancient 13,000-year-old tradition. He's an original language speaker. And the fact that he isn't literate has sort of left him with the mind of someone who's pre-literate. And pre-literate people aren't stupid, they're just not literate, so their brains are organized differently in many ways. And I've asked him about his intuition for his carvings, and he's told me that he dreams, like you've seen the Haida masks, you know what they look like. Well, his people are closely related to the Haida, so it's the same kind of style. He said he dreams in those animals and can remember his dreams, and he also talks to his grandparents who taught him how to carve in his dreams. Quite often, if he runs into a problem with carving, his grandparents will come and he'll talk to them, but he sees the creatures that he's going to carve living in an animated sense in his imagination. And I mean, it's not that difficult. First of all, I have no reason to disbelieve him. He's a very, very straightforward person, and he doesn't have the motivation or the guile, I would say, in some sense, to invent a story like that. There's just no reason he would possibly do it. I don't think he's told that many people about it. He thinks it's kind of crazy, you know. He said when he was a kid, he thought he was insane because he'd had those dreams all the time about these creatures and so forth. And so it wasn't something he was trumpeting. But I found it fascinating because I can see in him part of the manifestation of this unbroken tradition. We have no idea how traditions like that are really passed along for thousands and thousands of years, right? Part of it's oral and memory, part of it's acted out and dramatized, and then part of it's going to be imaginative. And people who aren't literate, they store information quite differently than we do. We don't remember anything. It's all written down in books, right? But if you're from an oral culture, especially if you're trained in that way, you have all of that information at hand, both so you can speak it, you can tell the stories, and you really know them. And you know, modern people don't really know what that's like anymore. I doubt if there's more than maybe 2 of you in the audience that could spout from memory like a 30-line poem. and poetry was written so that people could do that. That's why we have that form, is so that people could remember it and have it with them. And we don't do any of that anymore. Anyways, back to Jung. Jung was a great believer in the dream, and I noted that dreams will tell you things that you don't know. And then I thought, well, how the hell can that be? How in the world can something you think up tell you something you don't know? How does that make any sense? First of all, why don't you understand it? Why does it have to come forth in the form of the dream? It's like there's something going on inside you that you don't control, right? The dream happens to you just like life happens to you. I mean, there is the odd lucid dreamer who can, apply a certain amount of conscious control, but most of the time you're laying there asleep and this crazy complicated world manifests itself inside you, and you don't know how. You can't do it when you're awake, and you don't know what it means. It's like, what the hell's going on? And that's one of the things that's so damn frightening about the psychoanalysts, because you get this both from Freud and Jung, you really start to understand that there are things inside you that are happening that control you instead of the other way around. There's a bit of reciprocal control, but there's manifestations of spirits, so to speak, inside you that determine the manner in which you walk through life. And you don't control it. And what does? Is it random? There are people who have claimed that dreams are merely the consequence of random neuronal firing, which is a theory I think is absolutely absurd, because there's nothing random about dreams. They're very, very structured and very, very complex, and they're not like snow on a television screen or static on a radio. Like, those things are complicated. And then also I've seen so often that people have very coherent dreams that have a perfect narrative structure. They're fully developed in some sense, and so that theory just doesn't go anywhere with me. I just can't see that as useful at all. And so I'm more likely to take the phenomena seriously and say, well, there's something to dreams. Well, you dream of the future and then you try to make it into a reality. That seems to be an important thing. Or maybe you dream up a nightmare and try to make that into a reality, because people do that too if they're hell-bent on revenge, for example, and full of hatred and resentment. I mean, that manifests itself in terrible fantasies. Those are dreams, then people go act them out. These things are powerful, and whole nations can get caught up in collective dreams. That's what happened to the Nazis. That's what happened to Nazi Germany in the 1930s. It was an absolutely remarkable, amazing, horrific, destructive spectacle. And the same thing happened in the Soviet Union. The same thing happened in China. It's like, we have to take these things seriously, and try to understand what's going on. So Jung believed that the dream could contain more information than was yet articulated. You think artists do the same thing, like people go to museums and they look at paintings, Renaissance paintings or modern paintings, and they don't exactly know why they're there. I was in this room in New York. I don't remember which museum, but it was a room full of Renaissance art, great painters, the greatest painters, and thought maybe that room was worth $1 billion or something outrageous, because there was like 20 paintings in there, so priceless. And the first thing is, well, why are those paintings worth so much? And why is there a museum in the biggest city in the world devoted to them? And why do people from all over the world come and look at them? What the hell are those people doing? One of them was of the Assumption of Mary, beautifully painted, absolutely glowing work of art. And there's like 20 people standing in front of it looking at it. And you think, what are those people up to? They don't know. Why did they make a pilgrimage to New York to come and look at that painting? It's not like they know. Why is it worth so much? I mean, I know there's a status element to it too, but that begs the question, why do those items become such high status items? What is it about them that's so absolutely remarkable? Well, we're strange creatures. So I was trying to figure out in part, well, where did the information that's in the dream come from? Because it has to come from somewhere, and you could think about it as a revelation, because it's like it springs out of the void and it's new knowledge and it's a revelation. You didn't produce it, it just appears. But one of the things I want to do with this series is, like, I'm scientifically minded and I'm quite a rational person, and I like to have an explanation for things that's rational and empirical before I look for any other kind of explanation. And I don't want to say that everything that's associated with divinity can be reduced in some manner to biology or to an evolutionary history or anything like that. But insofar as it's possible to do that reduction, I'm going to do that. And I'm going to leave the other phenomena floating in the air because they can't be pinned down. And in that category, I would put the category of mystical or religious experience, which we don't understand at all. So, artists observe one another. They observe people and they represent what they see, and they transmit the message of what they see to us, and they teach us to see. And we don't necessarily know what it is that we're learning from them. But we're learning something, or at least we're acting like we're learning something. We go to movies, we watch stories, we immerse ourselves in fiction constantly. That's an artistic production. And for many people, the world of the arts is a living world, and that's particularly true if you're a creative person. And it's the creative, artistic people that do move the knowledge of humanity forward, and they do that with their artistic productions first. They're on the edge, and the dancers do that, and the poets do that, and the visual artists do that, and the musicians do that, and we're not sure what they're doing. Like, we're not sure what musicians are doing. What the hell are they doing? Why do you like music? You know, it gives you a deep intimation of the significance of things. And no one questions it. You go to a concert, you're thrilled. It's a quasi-religious experience, particularly if the people really get themselves together and get the crowd moving. You know, there's something incredibly intense about it, but it makes no sense whatsoever. It's not an easy thing to understand. Music is deeply patterned, and patterned in layers, and I think that has something to do with it, because reality is patterned and deeply patterned in layers, and so I think music is representing reality in some fundamental way, and that we get into the sway of that and sort of participate in being, and that's part of what makes it such an uplifting experience. But we don't really know that's what we're doing. We just go do it, and it's nourishing for people, right? I mean, young people in particular, lots of them live for music. It's where they derive all their meaning, their cultural identity. Everything that's nourishing comes from their affiliation with their music, and is part of their cultural identity. So that's an amazing thing. The question still remains, where does the information in dreams come from? And I think where it comes from is that we watch the patterns that everyone acts out. We've watched that forever, and we've got some representations of those patterns. That's part of our cultural history. That's what's embedded in stories, in fictional accounts of the story between good and evil, the bad guy and the good guy, and the romance. You know, these are canonical patterns of being for people, and they deeply affect us because they represent what it is that we will act out in the world. And then we flesh that out with the individual information we have about ourselves and other people. And so it's like there's waves of behavioral patterns that manifest themselves in the crowd across time. The great dramas are played on the crowd across time. And the artists watch that, and they get intimations of what that is, and they write it down and they tell us, and then we're a little clearer about what we're up to. You know, like a great dramatist like Shakespeare, let's say, we know that what he wrote is fiction, and then we say, well, fiction isn't true. But then you think, well, wait a minute, maybe it's true like numbers are true. You know, numbers are an abstraction from the underlying reality, but no one in their right mind would really think numbers aren't true. You could even make a case that the numbers are more real than the things that they represent, right? Because the abstraction is so insanely powerful. Once you have mathematics, you're just deadly. You can move the world with mathematics. And so it's not obvious that the abstraction is less real than the more concrete reality. And you take a work of fiction like Hamlet, and you think, well, is that, it's not true because it's fiction. But then you think, wait a minute, what kind of explanation is that? Like, maybe it's more true than nonfiction, because it takes the story that needs to be told about you, and the story that needs to be told about you, and you, and you, and you, and abstracts that out and says, look, here's something that's a key part of the human experience as such, right? So it's an abstraction from this underlying noisy substrate, and people are affected by it because they see that the thing that's represented is part of the pattern of their being. That's the right way to think about it. And then with these old stories, these ancient stories, it seems to me like that process has been occurring for thousands of years. It's like we watched ourselves and we extracted out some stories. We imitated each other and we represented that in drama, and then we distilled the drama and we got a representation of the distillation, and then we did it again. And at the end of that process that took God only knows how long, I think some of these stories they've traced fairy tales back 10,000 years, some fairy tales, in relatively unchanged form. And it certainly seems to me that the archaeological evidence, for example, suggests that the really old stories that the Bible begins with are at least that old and likely embedded in a prehistory that's far older than that. And you might think, well, how can you be so sure? And the answer to that in part is that cultures that don't change, like the ancient cultures, right? They didn't change as fast as us. They stay the same. That's the answer. So they keep their information moving generation to generation. That's how they stay the same. And so we know, again, in the archaeological record, there are records of rituals that have remained relatively unbroken for up to 20,000 years. It was discovered in caves in Japan that were set up for a particular kind of bear worship that was also characteristic of Western Europe. So these things can last for very long periods of time. We're watching each other act in the world. And then the question is, well, how long have we been watching each other? And the answer to that, in some sense, is, well, as long as there's been creatures with nervous systems. And that's a long time, that's some hundreds of millions of years, perhaps longer than that. We've been watching each other, trying to figure out what we're up to across that entire span of time. And some of that knowledge is built right into our bodies, which is why we can dance with each other, for example, right? Because understanding isn't just something that you have as an abstraction, it's something that you act out, That's what children are doing when they're learning to rough and tumble play, is they're learning to integrate their body with the body of someone else in a harmonious way, learning to cooperate and compete, and that's all instantiated right into their body. It's not abstract knowledge. They don't know that they're doing that, they're just doing it. And so we can even use our body as a representational platform. So we've been studying each other for a long time, abstracting out what is it that we're up to, and that's what is it we're up to? What should we be up to? That's even a more fundamental question. If you're going to live in the world and you're going to do it properly, what does properly mean? And how is it that you might go about that? Well, it's the right question, right? It's what everyone wants to know. How do you live in the world? Not what is the world made of? It's not the same question. How do you live in the world? It's the eternal question of human beings. And I guess we're the only species that has ever really asked that question, because all the other animals, they just go and do whatever they do. Not us. It's a question for us. We have to become aware of it. We have to be able to speak it. God only knows why. But that seems to be the situation. So we act. That acting is shaped by the world. That acting is shaped by society into something that we don't understand, but that we can model. We model it in our stories, and we model it with our bodies. And that's where the dream gets its information. The dream is part of the process that's watching everything and then trying to formulate it and trying to say, well, trying to get the signal out from the noise and to portray it in dramatic form, because a dream is a little drama. And then you get the chance to talk about what that dream is. And then you have something like articulated knowledge at that point. And so the Bible, I would say, it exists in that space that's half into the dream and half into articulated knowledge. It's something like that. And going into it to find out what the stories are about it can aid our self-understanding. And then the other issue is that if Nietzsche was correct, and if Dostoevsky or Jung was correct, and Dostoevsky as well, without the cornerstone that understanding provides, we're lost. And that's not good, because then we're susceptible to psychic pathology. That's psychological pathology. The people who are adamant anti-religious thinkers seem to believe that if we abandoned our immersement in the underlying dream, that we'd all instantly become rationalists like Descartes or Bacon, or intelligent, clear-thinking, rational, scientific people. And I don't believe that for a moment, because I don't think there's any evidence for it. I think we would become so irrational so rapidly that the weirdest mysteries of Catholicism would seem positively rational by contrast. And I think that's already happening. So... Okay. So this is the idea, essentially, that You have the unknown world. That's just what you don't know at all. That's the outside. That's the ocean that surrounds the island that you inhabit, something like that. It's chaos itself. And then you act in that world, and you act in ways you don't understand. There's more to your actions than you can understand. One of the things Jung said, I loved this when I first understood it, he said, everybody acts out a myth, but very few people know what their myth is. And you should know what your myth is because it might be a tragedy, and maybe you don't want it to be. And that's really worth thinking about because you have a pattern of behavior that characterizes you, and God only knows where you got it. Partly it's biological, partly it's from your parents, it's your unconscious assumptions, it's the way the philosophy of your society has shaped you, and it's aiming you somewhere. Well, is it aiming you somewhere you want to go? That's a good question. That's part of self-realization, We know we don't understand our actions. That's almost every argument you have with someone is about that. It's like, well, why did you do that? You come up with some half-baked reasons why you did it. You're flailing around in the darkness, you try to give an account for yourself, but you can only do it partially. It's very, very difficult because you're a complicated animal with the beginnings of an articulated mind, something like that, and you're just way more than you can handle. And all right, so you act things out, right? You act things out. And that's a kind of competence. And then you imagine what you act out, and you imagine what everyone else acts out. And so there's a tremendous amount of information in your action. And then that information is translated up into the dream and into art, into mythology and literature. And there's a tremendous amount of information in that. And then some of that is translated into articulated thought. And I'll give you a quick example of something like that. I think this is partly what happens in Exodus when Moses comes up with the law. He's wandering around with the Israelites forever in the desert, and they're like going left and going right and worshiping idols and like having a hell of a time and, getting rebellious. And Moses goes up in the mountain and he has this tremendous revelation sort of in the sight of God, and it illuminates him, and he comes down with the law. You think, well, Moses acted as a judge. I know this is a mythological story. Moses acted as a judge in the desert, and he was continually mediating between people who were having problems, constantly trying to keep peace. And so what are you doing when you're trying to keep peace? Is you're trying to understand what peace is, right? You have to apply the principles. Well, what are the principles? Well, you don't know. The principles are whatever satisfies people enough to make peace. And maybe you do that 10,000 times, and then you get some sense of, oh, here's the principles that bring peace. And then one day it blasts into your consciousness like a revelation. Here's the rules that we're already acting out. Well, that's the 10 Commandments. They're there to begin with. And Moses comes forward and says, look, this is already basically what we're doing, but now it's codified, right? And that's all a historical process that's condensed into a single story, but obviously that happened because we have written law. Right? And that emerged in good legal systems. That emerges from the bottom up. That's English common law is exactly like that. Right? It's single decisions that are predicated on principles that are then articulated and made into the body of law. And the body of law is something you act out. That's why it's a body of law. If you're a good citizen, you act out the body of law. And the body of law has principles. Okay, so the question is, there's principles that guide our behavior. What are those principles? Well, I think if you want the initial answer of what the archaic Israelites meant by God, that's something like what they meant. Now, it's not a good enough explanation, but look, imagine that you're a chimpanzee and you have a powerful, dominant figure at the pinnacle of your society. That represents power. Now, more than that, because it's not sheer physical prowess that keeps a chimp at the top of the hierarchy. It's much more complicated than that. But you could say, well, there's a principle that the dominant person manifests. And then you might say, well, that principle shines forth even more brightly if you know 10 people who are dominant, powerful. Then you can extract out what dominance means from that. You can extract out what power means from that. And then you can divorce the concept from the people. And we had to do that at some point because we can say power in a human context and we can imagine what that means, but it's divorced from any specific manifestation of power. Well, how the hell did we do that? That's so complicated. If you're a chimp, the power is in another chimp. It's not some damn abstraction. Well, so the question is, think about it. We're in these hierarchies, many of them across centuries. We're trying to figure out what the guiding principle is. We're trying to extract out the core of the guiding principle. And we turn that into a representation of a pattern of being. Well, it's something like that. That's God. It's an abstracted ideal. And it's put in personified form. It manifests itself in personified form, but that's okay, because what we're trying to get at is in some sense, the essence of what it means to be a properly functioning, properly social, and properly competent individual. We're trying to figure out what that means. You need an embodiment, you need an ideal that's abstracted that you could act out that would enable you to understand what that means. And that's what we've been driving at. So that's the first hypothesis in some sense. I'm going to go over some of the attributes of this abstracted ideal that we've formalized as God. But that's the first sort of hypothesis, is that a philosophical or moral ideal manifests itself first as a concrete pattern of behavior that's characteristic of a single individual. And then it's a set of individuals. And then it's an abstraction from that set. And then you have the abstraction. It's so important. So here's a political implication, for example. One of the debates, we might say, between early Christianity and the late Roman Empire was whether or not an emperor could be God, literally, right? To be deified, to be put in a temple. And you can see why that might happen, because that's someone at the pinnacle of a very steep hierarchy who has a tremendous amount of power and influence. But the Christian response to that was, never confuse the specific sovereign with the principle of sovereignty itself. It's brilliant. You see how difficult it is to come up with an idea like that, so that even the person who has the power is actually subordinate to something else. Subordinate to, let's call it a divine principle, for lack of a better word. So that even the king himself is subordinate to the principle. And we still believe that, because we believe that our president, our prime minister, is subordinate to the damn law, whatever the body of law, right? There's a principle inside that even the leader is subordinate to. And without that, you could argue you can't even have a civilized society, because your leader immediately turns into something that's transcendent and all-powerful. And I mean, that's certainly what happened in the Soviet Union, and what happened in Maoist China, and what happened in Nazi Germany, because there was nothing for the powerful to subordinate themselves to. You're supposed to be subordinate to God. So what does that mean? Well, we're going to tear that idea apart, but partly what it means is that you're subordinate, even if you're sovereign, to the principle of sovereignty itself. And then the question is, what the hell is the principle of sovereignty? And I could say, we have been working that out for a very long period of time. And so that's one of the things that we'll talk about, because the ancient Mesopotamians and the ancient Egyptians had some very interesting, dramatic ideas about that. So, just for example, very briefly, there was a deity known as Marduk. And Marduk, he was a Mesopotamian deity. And imagine this is sort of what happened, is that as an empire grew out of the post-Ice Age, say 15,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, all these tribes came together, and these tribes each had their own deity, their own image of the ideal, but then they started to occupy the same territory, right? And so then one tribe had God A and one tribe had God B, and one could wipe the other one out, and then it would just be God A who wins, but that's not so good, because, well, maybe you want to trade with those people, or maybe you don't want to lose half your population in a war, something like that. So then you have to have an argument about whose God is going to take priority, which ideal is going to take priority. And what seems to happen is that's represented in mythology as a battle of the gods in sort of celestial space, but from a practical perspective, it's more like an ongoing dialogue. You believe this, I believe this. You believe that, I believe this. How are we going to meld that together? So you take God A and you take God B, and maybe what you do is extract God C from them, and you say, well, God C now has the attributes of A and B, and then some other tribes come in, and then C takes them over too, and so you get, like with Marduk, for example, he has a multitude of names, 50 different names. Well, those are names at least in part, of the subordinate gods that represented the tribes that came together to make the civilization. That's part of the process by which that abstracted ideal is abstracted. You think this is important, and it works because your tribe's alive, and you think this is important, and it works because your tribe is alive. And so we'll take the best of both if we can manage it, and extract out something that's even more abstract that covers both of us if we can do it. And one of the things that's really interesting about Marduk, I'll just give you a couple of his features, but he has eyes all the way around his head. He's elected by all the other gods to be king god, so that's the first thing. That's quite cool. And they elect him because they're facing a terrible threat, sort of like a flood and a monster combined, something like that. And Marduk basically says that if they elect him top god, then he'll go out and stop the flood monster, and they won't all get wiped out. It's a serious threat. It's chaos itself making its comeback. And so all the gods agree. And Marduk is a new manifestation. He's got eyes all the way around his head, and he speaks magic words. And then he also goes out, and when he fights this deity called Tiamat. And we need to know that because the word Tiamat is associated with the word Tehom, T-E-H-O-M. And Tehom is the chaos that God makes order out of at the beginning of time in Genesis. So it's linked very tightly to this story. And Marduk, with his eyes and his capacity to speak magic words, goes out to confront Tiamat, who's like a watery sea dragon, something like that. It's a classic St. George story to go out and wreak havoc on the dragon. And he cuts her into pieces, and he makes the world out of her pieces. And that's the world that human beings live in. And the Mesopotamian emperor acted out Marduk. He was allowed to be emperor insofar as he was a good Marduk. And so that meant that he had eyes all the way around his head, and he could speak magic. He could speak properly. And so that we're starting to understand there at that point the essence of leadership, right? Because what's leadership? It's the capacity to see what the hell's in front of your face and maybe in every direction, and then the capacity to use your language properly in a transformative manner and to transform chaos into order. And God only knows how long it took the Mesopotamians to figure that out, and the best they could do is dramatize it, but it's staggeringly brilliant. You know, it's by no means obvious, and this chaos is a very strange thing, and this is the chaos that God wrestled with at the beginning of time. Chaos is it's half psychological and half real. There's no other way to really describe it. The chaos is what you encounter when you're thrown into deep confusion, right? When your world falls apart, when you encounter something that blows you into pieces, when your dreams die, when you're betrayed. It's the chaos that emerges, and the chaos is everything at once, and it's too much for you. And that's for sure. And it pulls you down into the underworld. And that's where the dragons are. And all you've got at that point is your capacity to bloody well keep your eyes open and to speak as carefully and clearly as you can. And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll get through it that way and come out the other side. And it's taken people a very long time to figure that out. And it looks to me like the idea is erected on the platform of our ancient ancestors, maybe tens of millions of years ago, because we seem to represent that which disturbs us deeply using the same system that we use to represent like serpentile or other carnivorous predators. And we're biological creatures, right? So when we've formulated our capacity to abstract, our strange capacity to abstract and use language, we still have all those underlying systems that were there when we were only animals. And we have to use those systems there. They're part of the emotional and motivational architecture of our thinking. And part of the reason we can demonize our enemies who upset our axioms is because we perceive them as if they're carnivorous predators. We do it with the same system. And that's chaos itself, the thing that always threatens us, right? The snakes that came to the trees when we lived in them like 60 million years ago. It's the same damn systems. So the Marduk story is partly the story of using attention and language to confront those things that most threaten us. And some of those things are real world threats, but some of them are psychological threats, which are just as profound but far more abstract. But we use the same systems to represent them. It's why you freeze if you're frightened, right? You're a prey animal. You're like a rabbit. You've seen something that's going to eat you. You freeze. And that way you're paralyzed. You're turned to stone, which is what you do when you see a Medusa with a head full of snakes, right? You're turned to stone. You're paralyzed. And the reason you do that is because you're using the predator detection system to protect yourself. Your heart rate goes way up, and you get ready to move. Things that upset us rely on that system. And then the story, the Marduk story, for example, is the idea that if there are things that upset you, chaotic, terrible, serpentine, monstrous, underworld things that threaten you, the best thing to do is to open your eyes and get your speech organized and go out and confront the thing and make the world out of it. And it's staggering. When I read that story and started to understand it, just blew me away that it's such a profound idea. And we know it's true, too, because we know in psychotherapy, for example, that you're much better off to confront your fears head on than you are to wait and let them find you. And so partly what you do if you're a psychotherapist is you help people break their fears into little pieces, the things that upset them, and then to encounter them one by one and master them. And so you're teaching this process of eternal mastery over the strange and chaotic world. And that all of that makes up some of the background. We haven't even got to the first sentence of the biblical stories yet. But all of that makes up the background. So you have to think that we've extracted this story, this strange collection of stories with all its errors and its repetitions and its peculiarities out of the entire history that we've been able to collect ideas. And it's the best we've been able to do. And I know there are other religious traditions. I'm not concerned about that at the moment because we can use this as an example, but it's the best we've been able to do. And what I'm hoping is that we can return to the stories in some sense with an open mind and see if there's something there that we actually need. And I hope that that will be the case. And as I said, I'll approach it as rationally as I possibly can. So, well, this is the idea to begin with, you know, is we have the unknown as such, and then we act in it like animals act. They act first. They don't think, they don't imagine, they act. And that's where we started. We started by acting. And then we started to be able to represent how we acted. And then we started to talk about how we represented how we acted. And that enabled us to tell stories, because that is what a story is. It's to tell about how you represent how you act. And so you know that because if you read a book, what happens? You read the book and images come to mind of the people in the book behaving, right? It's one step from acting it out. You don't act it out because you can abstract. You can represent action without having to act it out. It's an amazing thing, and that's part of the development of the prefrontal cortex. It's part of the capacity for human abstract thought, is that you can pull the behavior, the representation of the behavior, away from the behavior and manipulate the representation before you enact it. That's why you think, is so that you can generate a pattern of action and test it out in a fictional world before you embody it and die because you're foolish, right? You let the representation die, not you, and that's why you think. And so that's partly what we're trying to do with these stories. What do I hope to accomplish? I hope to end this 12-lecture series knowing more than I did when I started. That's my goal, because I said that, you know, I'm not telling you what I know. I'm trying to figure things out, and this is part of the process by which I'm doing that. And so I'm doing my best to think on my feet. You know, I come prepared, but I'm trying to stay on the edge of my capacity to generate knowledge and to make this continually clearer and to get to the bottom of things. And so I'm hoping that that's what I want to accomplish. And it seems like people are interested in that. So then we're going to try to accomplish that together. And so that's the plan. And the idea is to see if there's something at the bottom of this amazing civilization that we've managed to construct that I think is in peril for a variety of reasons. And maybe if we understand it a little bit better, we won't be so prone just to throw the damn thing away, which I think would be a big mistake. And to throw it away because of resentment and hatred and bitterness and historical ignorance and jealousy and the desire for destruction and all of that. It's like, I don't want to go there. It's a bad idea to go there, and we need to be grounded better. And so, hopefully, well, we'll see how this works. All right, so how do I approach this? Well, first of all, I think in evolutionary terms, you know, as far as I'm concerned, the cosmos is 15 billion years old, and the world is 4.5 billion years old, and there's been life for 3.5 billion years, and there were creatures that had pretty developed nervous systems 300 to 600 million years ago, and we were living in trees as small mammals 60 million years ago, and we were down on the plains between 60 million and 7 million years ago, and that's about when we split from chimpanzees, and modern human beings seem to emerge about 150,000 years ago, and civilization pretty much after the last ice age, something after 15,000 years ago. Not very long ago at all, you know. And that's the span across which I want to understand. That's the span across which I want to understand. I want to understand why we are the way we are, looking at life in its continual complexity, right from the beginning of life itself. And there's some real utility in that because we share attributes with other animals, even animals as simple as crustaceans, for example, have nervous system properties that are very much like ours, and it's very much worth knowing that. And so I think in an evolutionary way, I think it's a grand and remarkable way to think because it has this incredible time span, right? It's this amazing, I mean, people at the end of the 19th century, middle of the 19th century, thought the world was about 6,000 years old. I mean, 15 billion years old, that's a lot more, right? It's a lot grander, it's a lot bigger, but it's also a lot more frightening and alienating in some sense because, you know, the cosmos has become so vast, it's either easy for human beings to think of themselves as trivial specks on a trivial speck out some misbegotten hellhole end of the galaxy among hundreds of millions of galaxies, right? It's very easy to see yourself as nothing in that span of time, and that's a real challenge for people, and I think it's a mistake to think that way because I think consciousness is far more than we think it is, but it's still something we have to grapple with. I'm a psychoanalytic thinker, and what that means is that I believe that people are collections of subpersonalities and that those subpersonalities are alive. They're not machines. They have their viewpoint, they have their wants, they have their perceptions, they have their arguments, they have their emotions. They're like low-resolution representations of you. You know, when you get angry, it's a very low-resolution representation of you. It only wants rage, or it only wants something to eat, or it only wants water, it only wants sex. It's you, but shrunk and focused in a specific direction. And all those motivational systems are very, very ancient, very archaic, and very, very powerful. And they play a determining role in the manner in which we manifest ourselves. And as Freud pointed out with the id, we have to figure out how to take all those underlying animalistic motivations and emotions and civilize them in some way so that we can all live in the same general territory without tearing each other to shreds, which is maybe the default position of both chimpanzee and humanity. You know, so I take that seriously, the idea that we're a loose collection of spirits, and that you know, it says in the Old Testament somewhere that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, and I think this is akin to that. If you know that you're not in control of yourself thoroughly, and that there are other factors behind the scenes, like the Greeks thought that human beings were the playthings of the gods. That's the way they conceptualized the world. And they sort of meant the same thing. They meant that there are these great forces that move us, that we don't create, that we're subordinate to in some sense. Not entirely, but we can be subordinate to them, and they move our destinies. That was the Greek view, and there's something, it teaches you humility to understand that there's a hell of a lot more going on behind the scenes, and you're the driver of a very complex vehicle, but you don't understand the vehicle very well, and it's got its own motivations and methods, and sometimes you think it's doing something and it's doing something completely different. You see that in psychotherapy all the time because, you know, you help someone unwind a pattern of behavior that they've manifested forever. First of all, they describe it, then they become aware of it, then maybe they start to see what the cause is. They had no idea why they were acting like that. You know, they have to have the memory that produced the behavioral pattern to begin with. It has to be brought back to mind, and then it has to be analyzed and assessed, and then they have to think about a different way of acting, and it's extraordinarily complex. So, psychoanalytic, literary. Well, there's this postmodern idea about literature, and about the world for that matter, that if you take a complex piece of literature like a Shakespeare play, there's no end to the number of interpretations that you can make of it. You know, you can interpret each word, you can interpret each phrase, each sentence, each paragraph, you can interpret the entire play. The way you interpret it depends on how many other books you've read, depends on your orientation in the world. It depends on a very, very large number of things, how cultured you are or how much culture you lack, all of those things. It opens up a huge vista for potential interpretation. And so the postmodernists sort of stubbed their toe on that and thought, well, if there's this vast number of interpretations of any particular literary work, how can you be sure that any interpretation is more valid than any other interpretation? And if you can't be sure, then how do you even know those are great works? How do you know they can't? Maybe they're just works that the people in power have used to facilitate their continual accession of power, which is really a postmodern idea and a very, very cynical one, but it has its point. But the thing is, it's grounded in something real, right? It's like, yes, you can interpret things forever. I want to show you something here, just briefly. We'll go back to it later. Look at this. This is one of the coolest things I've ever seen. So, at the bottom here, every single one of those lines is a biblical verse, okay? Now, the length of the line is proportionate to how many times that verse is referred to in some way by some other verse. So you say, well, this is the first hyperlinked book, right? I'm dead serious about that. You can't click and get the hyperlinks, obviously, but it's a thoroughly hyperlinked book, and it's because, well, the people who worked on these stories that are hypothetically at the end, right, which is, the end can't affect the beginning. That's the rule of time, right? What happens now can't affect what happened to you 10 years ago, even though it actually can, but whatever. Well, you reinterpret things, right, and then they're not the same, but whatever, we won't get into that. But technically speaking, the present cannot affect the past, but if we're looking at a piece of literature, that's not right, because when you write the end, you know what was at the beginning, and when you write the beginning, or edit it, you know what's at the end. And so you can weave the whole thing together. And there's 65,000 cross-references, and that's what this map shows. And so that's a great visual representation of the book. And then you can see, well, why is it deep? Why is the book deep? Well, just imagine how many pathways you could take through that, right? I mean, you just journey through that forever. You'd never, ever get to the end of it. There's permutations and combinations, and every phrase is dependent on every other phrase, and every verse is dependent on every other, not entirely, but 65,000 is not a bad start. And so, okay, well, so that's another issue in some sense that seems to make the postmodernist critique even more correct. How in the world are you going to extract out a canonical interpretation of something like that? It's like it's not possible. But here's the issue, as far as I can tell. So the postmodernists extended that critique to the world. They said, look, well, a text is complicated enough. You can't extract out a canonical interpretation. What about the world? The world's way more complicated than a text, and so there's an infinite number of ways that you can look at the world. And so how do we know that any one way is better than any other way? And that's a good question. Now, the postmodern answer was we can't. And that's not a good answer, because you drown in chaos under those circumstances, right? You can't make sense of anything. And that's not good, because it's not neutral to not make sense of things. It's very anxiety-provoking. It's very depressing, because if things are so chaotic that you can't get a handle on them, your body defaults into emergency preparation mode, and your heart rate goes up, and your immune system stops working, and like you burn yourself out, you age rapidly, because you're surrounded by nothing you can control. That's an existential crisis, right? It's anxiety-provoking and depressing, very hard on people. And even more than that, it turns out that the way that we're constructed neurophysiologically is that we don't experience any positive emotion unless we have an aim and we can see ourselves progressing towards that aim. It isn't precisely attaining the aim that makes us happy. As you all know, if you've ever attained anything, because as soon as you attain it, then the whole little game ends. Then you have to come up with another game, right? So it's Sisyphus. And that's okay, but it does show that the attainment can't be the thing that drives you, because it collapses the game. That's what happens when you graduate from university. It's like you're king of the mountain for one day, and then you're like surf at Starbucks for the next 5 years, you know? So, yeah. So what happens is that human beings are weird creatures because we're much more activated by having an aim and moving towards it than we are by attainment. And what that means is you have to have an aim, and that means you have to have an interpretation. And it also means that the nobler the aim, that's one way of thinking about it, the better your life. And that's a really interesting thing to know because, you know, you've heard ever since you were tiny that you should act like a good person and you shouldn't lie, for example. And you might think, well, why the hell should I act like a good person and why not lie? I mean, even a 3-year-old can ask that question because smart kids learn to lie earlier, by the way. And they think, well, why not twist the fabric of reality so that it serves your specific short-term needs? I mean, that's a great question. Why not do that? Why act morally? If you can get away with something and it brings you closer to something you want, well, why not do it? These are good questions. It's not self-evident. Well, it seems to me tied in with what I just mentioned. It's like you destabilize yourself and things become chaotic. That's not good. And if you don't have a noble aim, then you have nothing but shallow, trivial pleasures, and they don't sustain you. And that's not good because life is so difficult, it's so much suffering, it's so complex. It ends and everyone dies and it's painful. It's like without a noble aim, how can you withstand any of that? You can't. You become desperate, and once you become desperate, things go from bad to worse very rapidly when you become desperate. And so there's the idea of the noble aim, and it's not something. It's something that's necessary. It's the bread that people cannot live without, right? That's not physical bread. It's the noble aim. And what is that? Well, it was encapsulated in part in the story of Marduk. It's to pay attention. It's to speak properly. It's to confront chaos. It's to make a better world. It's something like that. And that's enough of a noble aim so that you can stand up without, cringing at the very thought of your own existence, so that you can do something that's worthwhile to justify your wretched position on the planet. So now the literary issue is that, so look, you take a text, you can interpret it a variety of ways, but that's not right. This is where the postmodernists went wrong, because what you're looking for in a text, and in the world for that matter, is sufficient order and direction. So then we have to think, well, what does sufficient order and direction means? Well, you don't want to suffer so much that your life is unbearable, right? That just seems self-evident. Pain argues for itself. I think of pain as the fundamental reality because no one disputes it, right? I mean, even if you say that you don't believe in pain, it doesn't help when you're in pain. You still believe in it, right? You can't pry it up with logic and rationality. It just stands forth as what the fundament of existence, and that's actually quite useful to know. Say, well, you don't want any more of that than is absolutely necessary. And I think that's self-evident. And then you say, well, wait a minute, it's more complicated than that. You don't want any more of that that's necessary today, but also not tomorrow and not next week and not next month and not next year. So however you act now, better not compromise how you're going to be in a year, because that would just be counterproductive. That's part of the problem with short-term pleasures, right? It's like act in haste, repent at leisure. Everyone knows exactly what that means. So you have to act in a way that works now and tomorrow and next week and next month and so forth. And so you have to take your future self into account. And human beings can do that. And taking your future self into account isn't much different than taking other people into account, right? Because I remember there's this Simpson episode, and Homer downs a quart of mayonnaise and vodka. And he says, Marge says, you shouldn't really do that. And Homer says, that's a problem for future Homer. I'm sure glad I'm not that guy. That's so ridiculously comical, But you see, we have to grapple with that. And so the you that's out there in the future is sort of like another person. And so figuring out how to conduct yourself properly in relationship to your future self isn't much different than figuring out how to conduct yourself in relationship to other people. But then we could expand the constraints. Not only does the interpretation that you extract have to protect you from suffering and give you an aim, but it has to do it in a way that's iterable. So it works across time, and then it has to work in the presence of other people so that you can cooperate with them and compete with them in a way that doesn't make you suffer more. And people they're not that tolerant. You know, I mean, they have choices. They don't have to hang around with you. They can hang around with any one of these other primates. And so if you don't act properly, at least within certain boundaries, it's like you're just cast aside. And so people are broadcasting information at you all the time about how you need to interpret the world so they can tolerate being around you. And you need that because socially isolated, you're insane and then you're dead. No one can tolerate being alone for any length of time. We can't maintain our own sanity without continual feedback from other people because it's too damn complicated. So you're constrained by your own existence, and then you're constrained by the existence of other people. And then you're also constrained by the world. You know, if I read Hamlet and what I extract out of that is the idea that I should jump off a bridge, it's like it puts my interpretation to an end rather quickly. It doesn't seem to be optimally functional, let's say. And so an interpretation is constrained by the reality of the world, it's constrained by the reality of other people, and it's constrained by your reality across time. And there's only a small number of interpretations that are going to work in that tightly defined space. And so that's part of the reason that the postmodernists are wrong. It's also part of the reason, by the way, that AI people who've been trying to make intelligent machines have had to put them in a body. Because it turns out that you just can't make something intelligent in some sense without it being embodied. And it's partly for the reasons that I just described, is you need constraints on the system so that the system doesn't drown in an infinite sea of interpretation. It's something like that. So that's the literary end of it. Moral. Well, morality for me is about action. And I'm an existentialist in some sense, and what that means is that I believe that what people believe to be true is what they act out, not what they say. And so there's lots of definitions of truth. I mean, truth is a very expansive word, and you can think of objective truth. But behavioral truth isn't the same as objective truth. What you should do isn't the same as what is. As far as I can tell, people debate that. But I think the reason that that has to be the case is because, think about it this way. You're standing in front of a field, and you can see the field. But the field doesn't tell you how to walk through it. There's an infinite number of ways you could walk through it. And so you can't extract out an inviolable guide to how you should act from the array of facts that are in front of you. Because there's just too many facts. And they don't have directionality. But you need to know. You need to know how not to suffer. And you need to know what your aim is. And so you have to overlay that objective reality with some interpretive structure. And it's the nature of that interpretive structure that we're going to be aiming at hard. I've given you some hints about it already. We've extracted it in part from observations of our own behavior and other people's behavior. And we've extracted it in part by the nature of our embodiment that's been shaped over hundreds of millions of years. But we see the infinite plane of facts and we impose a moral interpretation on it. And the moral interpretation is what to do about what is. And that's associated both with security, because you just don't need too much complexity, and also with aim. And so we're mobile creatures, right? We need to know where we're going, because all we're ever concerned about, roughly speaking, is where we're going. That's what we need to know. Where are we going? What are we doing and why? And that's not the same question as what is the world made of objectively. It's a different question, it requires different answers. And so that's the domain of the moral as far as I'm concerned, which is, well, what are you aiming at? And that's the question of the ultimate ideal in some sense. Even if you have trivial little, fragmentary ideals, there's something trying to emerge out of that that's more coherent and more integrated and more applicable and more practical. And that's the other thing, is that, you think about literature and you think about art and you think those aren't very tightly tied to the earth. They're Empyrean and airy and spiritual, and they don't seem practical, but I'm a practical person. And part of the reason that I want to assess these books from a literary and aesthetic and evolutionary perspective is to extract out something of value, something of real value that's practical. Something, because one of the rules that I have when I'm lecturing is that I don't want to tell anybody anything that they can't use, because I think of knowledge as a tool. It's something to implement in the world. We're tool-using creatures, and our knowledge is tools. And we need tools to work in the world. We need tools to regulate our emotions and to make things better and to put an end to suffering to the degree that we can and to live with ourselves properly and to stand up properly. And you need the tools to do that. And so I don't want to do anything in this lecture series that isn't practical. You know, I want you to come away having things put together in a way that you can immediately apply, not interested in abstraction for the sake of abstraction. Rational, well, it's got to make sense, you know, because the more restrictions on your theory, the better. And so I want it all laid out causally so that B follows A and B precedes C and in a way that's understandable and doesn't require any unnecessary leap of faith. You know, because that's another thing that I think interferes with our relationship with a collection of books like the Bible, is that you're called upon to believe things that no one can believe. And that's no good, because that's a form of lie as far as I can tell. And then you have to scrap the whole thing, because in principle the whole thing's about truth. And if you have to start your pursuit of truth by swallowing a bunch of lies, then how in the world are you going to get anywhere with that? And so I don't want any uncertainty at the bottom of this, or I don't want any more than I can get, than I have to leave in it, because I can't get any farther than that. And so it's going to make sense rationally. I don't want it to be pushing up against what we know to be scientifically untrue, even though science is in flux, and that's, you know, somewhat of a dangerous parameter. If it isn't working with evolutionary theory, for example, then I think that it's not a good enough solution. So, and then finally, it's phenomenological. Modern people, you know, we think of reality as objective, and that's very powerful. But that isn't how we experience reality. We have our domain of experience, you know, and this is a hard thing to get a grip on, even though it should be the most obvious thing. For the phenomenologists, everything that you experience is real. And so they're interested in the structure of your subjective experience. And you say, well, you have subjective experience, and you have subjective experience, and so do you. And there's commonalities across all of those. Like, for example, you're likely to experience the same set of emotions. You know, we've been able to identify canonical emotions and canonical motivations. And without that, we couldn't even communicate, because you wouldn't know what the other person was like. You'd have to explain infinitely. There's nothing you could take for granted, but you can. You know, and phenomenology is the fact that in the center of my vision, my hands are very clear, and then out in the periphery, they disappear. And phenomenology is the way things smell and the way things taste and the fact that they matter. And so you could say in some sense that phenomenology is the study of what matters rather than matter. And it's a given from the phenomenological perspective that things have meaning. And you know, even if you're a rationalist, say, and a cynic and a nihilist, and you say, well, nothing has any meaning, you still run into the problem of pain, because pain undercuts your arguments and has a meaning. So there's no escaping from the meaning. You can pretty much demolish all the positive parts of it, but trying to think your way out of the negative parts, man, good luck with that, because that just doesn't work. So phenomenology is, and the Bible stories, and I think this is true of fiction in general, is phenomenological. And it concentrates on trying to elucidate the nature of human experience, and that is not the same as the objective world. But it's also a form of truth, because it is truth that you have a field of experience and that it has qualities. The question is, what are the qualities? Now, ancient representations of reality were sort of a weird meld of observable phenomena, things that we would consider objective facts, and subjective truth, the projection of subjective truth. And I'll show you, for example, I'll show you how the Mesopotamians viewed the world. They had a model. Basically, the world was a disc. You know, if you go out in a field at night, what does the world look like? Well, it's a disc. It's got a dome on top of it. Well, that was basically the Mesopotamian view of the world, and the view of the world that the people who wrote the first stories in the Bible believed too. And on top of the dome there was water. Well, obviously, it's like it rains, right? Where does the water come from? Well, there's water around the dome. And then there's land, that's the disk, and then underneath that there's water. How do you know that? Well, drill. You'll hit water. Well, it's under the earth, obviously, because otherwise how would you hit the water? And then what's under that? There's fresh water. And then what's under that? Well, if you go to the edge of the disk, you hit the ocean. It's salt water. So it's a dome with water outside of it. And then it's a disk that the dome sits on. And then underneath that there's fresh water. And then underneath that there's salt water. And that was roughly the Mesopotamian world. And you see that's a mix of observation and imagination, right? Because that isn't the world, but it is the way the world appears. It's a perfectly believable cosmology. And the sun rises and the sun sets on that dome. It's not like the thing is bloody well spinning. Who would ever think that up? It's obviously the sun comes up and goes down and then travels underneath the world and comes back up again. There's nothing more self-evident than that. Well, that's that strange intermingling of subjective fantasy, let's say, right at the level of perception and actual observable phenomena. And a lot of the cosmology that's associated with the biblical stories is exactly like that. It's half psychology and half reality, although the psychological is real as well. So that, and to know that the biblical stories have a phenomenological truth is really worth knowing, because, you know, the poor fundamentalists, they're trying to cling to their moral structure, and, you know, I understand why, because it does organize their societies and it organizes their psyche, so they've got something to cling to, but, you know, they don't have a very sophisticated idea of the complexity of what constitutes truth, and they try to gerrymander the biblical stories into the domain of scientific theory, you know, promoting creationism, for example, as an alternative scientific theory. It's like that just isn't going to go anywhere, you know, because the people who wrote these damn stories weren't scientists to begin with. There weren't any scientists back then. There's hardly any scientists now. You know, it's hard to think scientifically, man. It's like it takes a lot of training, and even scientists don't think scientifically once you get them out of the lab, and hardly even when they're in the lab. You know, you got to get peer-reviewed and criticized, and like it's hard to think scientifically. So, and however the people who wrote these stories thought was more like dramatists think, more like Shakespeare thought, but that doesn't mean that there isn't truth in it. It just means that you have to be a little bit more sophisticated about your ideas of truth. And that's okay, you know. There are truths to live by. Okay, well, fine. Then we want to figure out what those are, because we need to live and maybe not to suffer so much. So if you know that what the Bible stories and stories in general are trying to represent is the lived experience of conscious individuals, like the structure of the lived experience of conscious individuals, then that opens up the possibility of a whole different realm of understanding and eliminates the contradiction that's been painful for people between the objective world and let's say the claims of religious stories. So, okay, so let's take a look at the structure of the book itself. So the first thing about the Bible is that it's a comedy, and a comedy has a happy ending, right? So that's a strange thing, because the Greek God stories were almost always tragic. Now, the Bible is a comedy. It has a happy ending. Everyone lives. There's a heaven. So now, what you think about that is a completely different issue. I'm just telling you the structure of the story. It's something like there was paradise at the beginning of time, and then some cataclysm occurred and people fell into history, and history is limitation and mortality and suffering and self-consciousness. But there's a mode of being, or potentially the establishment of a state, that will transcend that. And that's what time is aiming at. So that's the idea of the story. Now, it's a funny thing that the Bible has a story because it wasn't written as a book, right? It was assembled from a whole bunch of different books. And the fact that it got assembled into something resembling a story is quite remarkable. And what the question is then, well, what is that story about? And how did it come up as a story? And then I suppose as well, is there anything to it? It constitutes a dramatic record of self-realization or abstraction. We already mentioned that. It's like the idea, for example, of the formulation of the, let's say, the image of God is an abstraction. That's how we're going to handle it to begin with. I want to say, though, because I said I wasn't going to be any more reductionist than necessary. I know that the evidence for genuine religious experience is incontrovertible, but it's not explicable. And so I don't want to explain it away. I want to just leave it as a fact. And then I want to pull back from that and say, okay, well, we'll leave that as a fact and a mystery, but we'll look at this, we're going to look at this from a rational perspective and say that the initial formulation of the idea of God was an attempt to abstract out the ideal and to consider it as an abstraction outside its instantiation. So, and that's good enough. That's an amazing thing if it's true. But I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, let's say. It's a collection of books with multiple redactors and editors. So what does that mean? Many people wrote it. There's many different books, and they're interwoven together, especially in the first 5 books, by people who, I suspect, took the traditions of tribes that had been brought together under a single political organization and tried to make their accounts coherent. And so they took a little of this, and they took a little of that, and they took a little of this, and they tried not to lose anything because it seemed valuable, or it was certainly valuable to the people who had collected the stories. They weren't going to, tolerate too much editing, but they also wanted it to make sense to some degree, so it wasn't completely logically contradictory and completely absurd. And so many people wrote it, and many people edited it, and many people assembled it over a vast stretch of time. And we have very few documents like that. And so just because we have a document like that is sufficient reason to look at it as a remarkable phenomena and try to understand what it is that it's trying to communicate, let's say. And then I said it's also the world's first hyperlinked text, which is that again, and very much worth thinking about for quite a long time. All right, there's 4 sources in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. 4 stories that we know came together. One was called the priestly. There's a source called the priestly, and it used the name Elohim or El Shaddai for God. And I believe El is the root word for Ella as well. So, and that's usually translated as God or the gods, because Elohim is utilized as plural in the beginning books of the Bible. And it's newer than the Yahwist version. Now, the reason I'm telling you that is because Genesis 1, which is the first story, isn't as old as Genesis 2. Genesis 2 contains, the Yahwist version contains the story, for example, of Adam and Eve. And that's older than the very first book in the Bible. But they decided to put the newer version first, and well, it isn't, and I think it's because it deals with more fundamental abstractions. It's something like that. It's like it deals with the most basic of abstractions, how the universe was created, and then segues into what the human environment is like. And so that seems to be the logic behind it. The Yahwist version uses the name YHWH, which apparently people didn't say, but we believe was pronounced something like Yahweh. And it has a strongly anthropomorphic God, so one that takes human form. It begins with Genesis 2:4. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when, and it contains the story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Noah and the Tower of Babel and Exodus and Numbers, along with the priestly version. It also contains the law in just the form of the 10 Commandments, which is like a truncated form of the law. There's the Elohist source. It contains the stories of Abraham and Isaac. It's concerned with a heavenly hierarchy that includes angels. It talks about the departure from Egypt, and it presents the covenant code, which is this idea of that, that society is predicated. This was Israeli society. It was predicated on a covenant with God, and that's laid out in a sequence of rules, some of which are the 10 Commandments, but many of which are much more extensive than that. And then the final one is the Deuteronomist code, and it contains the bulk of the law and what's called the Deuteronomic history, and it's independent of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And so we know that at least now there's debate about this like there is about everything, so I'm brushing over a very large area of scholarship, but people generally assume that there were multiple authors over multiple periods of time, and the way they've concluded that is by looking at textual analysis, trying to see where there are chunks of the stories that have the same kind of style or the same reference. And people argue about that because, obviously it's difficult to recreate something ancient, but That's the basic idea. So it is an amalgam of viewpoints about these initial issues, and that's important to know. So it's like a collective story. And okay, now to understand the first part of Genesis, I'm going to turn, strangely enough, to something that's actually part of the New Testament, and this is a central element of Christianity. And it's a very strange idea, and it's going to take a very long time to unpack, but the idea, this is what John said about Christ. He said, in the beginning was the Word, and so that relates back to Genesis 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Three sentences like that take a lot of unpacking because, well, none of that seems to make any sense whatsoever, really, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was both with God, and the Word was God. So the first question might be, what in the world does that mean? In the beginning was the Word. That's the Logos, actually. And the Logos is embodied in the figure of Christ. So there's this idea in John that whatever Christ is, the Son of God, is not only instantiated in history, say at a particular time and place as a carpenter in some backwoods part of the world, but also something eternal that exists outside of time and space that was there right at the beginning. And as far as I can tell, what that Logos represents is something like modern people. It's something like what modern people refer to when they talk about consciousness. It's something like that. It's more than that. It's like consciousness and its capacity to be aware and its capacity to communicate. It's something like that. And there's an idea underneath that, which is that being, especially from a phenomenological perspective, so the being that is experience cannot exist without consciousness. It's like consciousness shines a light on things to bring it into being. Because without consciousness, what is there? No one experiences anything. It's like, is there anything when no one experiences anything? That's the question. And the answer that this book is presenting is that, no, you have to think about consciousness as a constituent element of reality. It's something that's necessary for reality itself to exist. Now, of course, it depends on what you mean by reality. But the reality that's being referred to here, I told you already, is this strange amalgam of the subjective experience and the world. But the question is deeper than that too, because it is by no means obvious what there is if there's no one to experience it. I mean, the whole notion of time itself seems to collapse, at least in terms of something like felt duration, and the notion of size disappears essentially because there's nothing to scale it, and the causality seems to vanish. And so, and we don't understand consciousness, not in the least. We don't understand what it is that is in us that gives illumination to being. And what happens in the Old Testament, at least in part, is that that consciousness is associated with the divine. Now you think, well, is that a reasonable proposition? And that's a very complicated question, but at least we might note that there's something to the claim, because there is a miracle of experience and existence that's dependent on consciousness. I mean, people try to explain it away constantly, but it doesn't seem to work very well. And here's something else to think about, I think, that's really worth thinking about. People do not like it when you treat them like they're not conscious, right? They react very badly to that. And then you don't like it if someone assumes that you're not conscious, and you don't like it if someone assumes that you don't have free will, you know, that you're just absolutely determined in your actions, and there's nothing that's going to repair you, and that you don't need to have any responsibility for your actions. It's like our culture, the laws of our culture are predicated on the idea, something like people are conscious, people have experience, people make decisions and can be held responsible for them, that there's a free will element to it. And you can debate all that philosophically, and fine, but the point is that that is how we act, and that is the idea that our legal system is predicated on. And there's something deep about it, because, you know, you're subject to the law, but the law is also limited by you, which is to say that in a well-functioning, properly grounded democratic system, you have intrinsic value. That's the source of your rights. Even if you're a murderer, we have to say the law can only go so far because there's something about you that's divine. Well, what does that mean? Well, partly it means that there's something about you that's conscious and capable of communicating, like you're a whole world unto yourself. And you have that to contribute to everyone else, and that's valuable. I mean, that you can learn new things, you can transform the structure of society, you can invent a new way of dealing with the world. You're capable of all that. It's an intrinsic part of you, and that's associated with this. It's associated, that's the idea there, is that there's something about the logos that is necessary for the absolute chaos of the reality beyond experience to manifest itself as reality. It's an amazing idea because it gives consciousness a constitutive role in the cosmos. And you can debate that, but it's not, you can't just bloody well brush it off. Because first of all, we are the most complicated things there are that we know of by a massive amount. We're so complicated that it's unbelievable. And so, there's a lot of cosmos out there, but there's a lot of cosmos in here too. And which one is greater is by no means obvious unless you use something trivial like relative size, which, really isn't a very sophisticated approach. And whatever it is that is you has this capacity to experience reality and to transform it, which is a very strange thing. You can conceptualize a future in your imagination, and then you can work and make that manifest. You participate in the process of creation. That's one way of thinking about it. And so that's why I think in Genesis 1, it relates the idea that human beings are made in the image of the divine, men and women, which is interesting too, because, the feminists are always criticizing Christianity, for example, as being, inexorably patriarchal. Of course, they criticize everything like that, so it's hardly a stroke of bloody brilliance. But I think it's an absolute miracle that right at the beginning of the document, it says straightforwardly, like with no hesitation whatsoever, that the divine spark, which we're associating with the word that brings forth being, is manifest in men and women equally. That's a very cool thing. And you got to think, well, like I said, do you actually take that seriously? Well, what you got to ask is, what happens if you don't take it seriously? Right? That's read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. That's the best investigation of that tactic that's ever been produced, because what happens in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is that the main character, whose name is Raskolnikov, decides that there's no intrinsic value to other people, and that as a consequence he can do whatever he wants. It's only cowardice that stops him from acting, right? Because why would it be anything else if the value of other people is just an arbitrary superstition? Then why can't I do exactly what I want when I want, which is the psychopath's viewpoint? Well, so Raskolnikov does. He kills someone who's a very horrible person, and he has very good reasons for killing her. And he's half-starved and a little bit insane and possessed by this ideology. It's brilliant, brilliant layout. And he finds out something after he kills her, which is that the post-killing Raskolnikov and the pre-killing Raskolnikov are not the same person even a little bit. Because he's broken a rule, like he's broken a serious rule, and there's no going back. And Crime and Punishment is the best investigation I know of what happens if you take the notion that there's nothing divine about the individual seriously. Now, most of the people I know who are deeply atheistic, and I understand why they're deeply atheistic, they haven't contended with people like Dostoevsky, not as far as I can tell. Because I don't see logical flaws in Crime and Punishment. I think he got the psychology exactly right. And Dostoevsky's amazing for this, because in one of his books, The Devils, for example, he describes a political scenario that's not much different than the one we find ourselves in now. And there are these people who are possessed by rationalistic, utopian, atheistic ideas, and they're very powerful. They give rise to the communist revolution, right? I mean, they're powerful ideas. And his character, Stavrogan, also acts out the presupposition that human beings have no intrinsic nature and no intrinsic value. And it's another brilliant investigation, and Dostoevsky prophesies, that's what I would say, what will happen to a society if it goes down that road? And he was dead exactly accurate. It's uncanny to read Dostoevsky's The Possessed or The Devils, depending on the translation, and then to read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, because one is fiction and prophecy, and the second is, hey, look, it turned out exactly the way that Dostoevsky said it would for exactly the same reasons. So it's quite remarkable. So the question is, do you contend seriously with the idea that A, there's something cosmically constitutive about consciousness, and B, that might well be considered divine, and C, that is instantiated in every person? And then ask yourself if you're not a criminal if you don't act it out. And then ask yourself what that means. Is that reflective of a reality? Is it a metaphor? Like maybe it's a metaphor, a complex metaphor that we have to use to organize our societies. Could well be, but even as a metaphor, it's true enough so that we mess with it at our peril. And it also took people a very long time to figure out. This is Genesis 1. You know what, I'm probably going to stop there because I believe it's 9:30. And so we didn't even get to the first line. Yeah. Look, I want to read you a couple of things that we'll use as a prodroma for the next lecture, because I'll just bounce through a collection of ideas that's associated with the notion of divinity, okay? And then we'll turn back to the first lines when we start the next lecture. I have no idea how far I'm going to get through the biblical stories, by the way, because I'm trying to figure this out as I go along. Okay, so, there's an idea in Christianity that the image of God is a trinity, right? There's the Father, there's the element of the Father, there's the element of the Son, and there's the element of the Holy Spirit. And it's something like tradition, the spirit of tradition. It's something like the human being as the newest incarnation of that tradition, like the living incarnation of that tradition. And then it's something like the spirit in people that makes relationship with this and this possible, the spirit in individuals. And so I'm going to bounce my way quickly through some of the classical metaphorical attributes of God so that we kind of have a cloud of notions about what we're talking about when we return to Genesis 1 and talk about the God who spoke chaos into being. So there's a fatherly aspect. So here's what God as a father is like. You can enter into a covenant with it, so you can make a bargain with it. Now you think about that, money is like that, because money is a bargain you make with the future, right? And so we've structured our world so that you can negotiate with the future. And I don't think that we would have got to the point where we could do that without having this idea to begin with. You can act as if the future is a reality. There's a spirit of tradition that enables you to act as if the future is something that can be bargained with. That's why you make sacrifices, right? And the sacrifices were acted out for a very long period of time, and now they're psychological. We know that you can sacrifice something valuable in the present and expect that you're negotiating with something that represents the transcendent future. And that's an amazing human discovery. Like no other creature can do that, to act as if the future is real. To note that you can bargain with reality itself and that you can do it successfully. It's unbelievable. It responds to sacrifice. It answers prayers. I'm not saying that any of this is true, by the way. I'm just saying what the cloud of ideas represents. It punishes and rewards. It judges and forgives. It's not nature. You see, one of the things that's weird about the Judeo-Christian tradition is that God and nature are not the same thing at all. Whatever God is, partially manifest in this logos, is something that stands outside of nature. And I think that's something like consciousness as abstracted from the natural world. So it built Eden for mankind and then banished us for disobedience. It's too powerful to be touched. It granted free will. Distance from it is hell. Distance from it is death. It reveals itself in dogma and in mystical experience, and it's the law. So that's sort of like the fatherly aspect. And then the son-like aspect, it speaks chaos into order. It slays dragons and feeds people with the remains. It finds gold. It rescues virgins. It's the body and blood of Christ. It's a tragic victim and scapegoat and eternally triumphant redeemer simultaneously. It cares for the outcast. It dies and is reborn. It's the King of kings and hero of heroes. It's not the state, but is both the fulfillment and critic of the state. It dwells in the perfect house. It is aiming at paradise or heaven. It can rescue from hell. It cares for the outcast. It's the foundation stone and the cornerstone that was rejected. And it's the spirit of the law. And then it's spirit-like. It's akin to the human soul. It's the prophetic voice. It's the still small voice of conscience. It's the spoken truth. It's called forth by music. It is the enemy of deceit, arrogance, and resentment. It's the water of life. It burns without consuming, and it's a blinding light. Okay, so that's a very well-developed set of poetic metaphors, essentially, right? So these are all, what would you say, glimpses of the transcendent ideal. That's the right way of thinking about it. They're glimpses of the transcendent ideal. And all of them have a specific meaning. And, well, in part what we're going to do is go over that meaning as we continue with this series. And so what we've got now is a brief description, at least, of what this is. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We know it's associated with the Logos in this sequence of stories. We know it's associated with the Word and with consciousness. And we know that it's associated with whatever God is. And then I laid out the metaphoric landscape that, at least in part, describes God. And so now we have some sense of the being that does this, creates the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void. That's that chaotic state of intermingled confusion. And darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And so we'll stop with that, because now we're ready to take a tentative step into the very first part of this book. And it's important to have your conceptual framework properly organized so that you can appreciate where it's going and what it might possibly mean. And so, well, I've done what I can today to, what would you say, elaborate on this single word, I suppose. And but it's a big word, you know, so it's not so unreasonable that it takes a long time to get to the point where you have any sense of what it means at all. All right. That is nowhere near, that is not, I thought I would get a lot farther than that. All right. So thank you very much.